Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit. Bandwidth for Triangulation is brought to you by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com. This is Triangulation with Tom Merritt and Leo Laporte. Number 7, Stephen Wolfram. It's time for Triangulation, episode number 7. Recorded on March 16th, 2011. Leo Laporte with Tom Merritt. And in a moment, our guest is going to join us via phone because he doesn't Skype, Stephen Wolfram, the founder and CEO of Wolfram Research, and about one of the most interesting mathematicians, scientists, and big thinkers out there. He's a physicist by trade.
Born Saturday, August 29th, 1959 in London.
Did you look that up on Wolframalpha?
I looked it up on Wolframalpha. That's what it said.
He's best known, I think, perhaps for creating the Mathematica software. He actually did that originally as part of a project, university project at California Institute of Technology, where he got a PhD at the ripe old age of 20. He was one of the first MacArthur Award recipients in 1981. And Mathematica is essentially a computer algebra system, or symbolic manipulation program, they call them, SMP.
I had a guy I went to college with who was very proud of his Mathematica on a Next computer that he had in his house.
Yeah, it's very cool.
Yeah.
Very powerful, and I don't pretend to understand it since I'm not a mathematician, but think of it as a very fancy graphing calculator, or a digital blackboard, perhaps would be a better description of it. He, in the 90s, wrote and published in 2002 a very interesting book, very thick book, well beyond my means to understand, called A New Kind of Science, in which he basically, according to Wikipedia, proposed that the universe is digital in its nature, and that simple programs can describe the fundamental laws of the universe. He thinks that eventually scientists will realize this, and it will have a major influence on physics, chemistry, and biology. It'll be a new kind of science, if you will. So he continues to give conferences and has a summer school devoted to that. But most recently, he created Wolframalpha, which is a website that is not a search engine, but in fact a computational knowledge engine. Stephen Wolfram joins us right now via phone. Stephen, thank you for joining us on Triangulation.
Hi.
We just went through an entire CV for you.
Okay, thank you.
You didn't have to sit through that one more time. Let me ask you about A New Kind of Science, which I said right up front is completely beyond my means to understand. But I think our audience, being a technologically literate audience, might be intrigued by the simplified description, at least the one that Wikipedia runs, that says that the universe is digital in its nature, and that the fundamental laws of the universe can be described as simple programs. Is that an accurate representation?
Well, not really. That's kind of an application of the big idea, but that isn't the main idea. It's kind of like the traditional thought for the last, 300 or so years has been, maybe longer than that, has been let's use mathematics to describe how things work.
Right.
Things that might be things we construct as humans, things that might be things that exist in nature. But sort of mathematics exists apart from its success or lack of success in describing the physical world. And so similarly with the kind of science, I've spent a long time building sort of the big idea is to explore this kind of computational universe of possible programs and to understand what's out there in this computational universe. It's then sort of a separate question whether what's out there in this computational universe turns out to be a good description of our particular physical universe. But what happens in the sort of computational universe, one of the big discoveries is that even programs whose structure is very simple, things you might write in, one line of Mathematica code or something like this, even these incredibly simple programs turn out to be capable of extremely complex behavior. And that fact is something that I think is sort of key to understanding a lot of what happens in nature. It's also a fact that can get used to do lots of technological kinds of things. I mean, it's important in nature because, when we see something complicated go on in nature, whether it's coming from physics or whether it's some biological process or something like this, the natural instinct is if it looks complicated to us, then whatever causes it must be somehow correspondingly complicated. But what we discover from sort of this basic science of the computational universe is that doesn't have to be true. There can be extremely simple programs in the computational universe that can lead to incredibly complicated behavior, much like what nature seems to use to do the things that we see it doing.
So this sounds a little bit like the work you did early on with the cellular automata.
Right. So it emerged from that. So kind of I originally thought, originally I was interested in kind of physics and cosmology and all sorts of things like that, and I kind of asked myself, how did all this complicated stuff that we see in the universe come to be? And I thought, well, let me find the very simplest possible model. And my initial idea was, let me go to the point where my model is so simple that it doesn't work at all. That's so simple that it will never produce any of the interesting things we see in the universe.
You mean like Conway's life? That's the first thing that leaps to my mind.
Well, so the things I looked at are even simpler than that. They're things that just involve, for example, a line of black and white cells, and then at every step you say, what will the cell right underneath a particular cell be, and you kind of evolve it down the page. Mm-hmm. So there's no, you're not making a video, you're just making a picture, so to speak.
Right.
And so the issue then is that there are among the sort of the simplest possible rules of determining, the color of a cell, black or white, based on the color of the cell above it and to its left or right. There are 256 of those rules. And I kind of, my first assumption was something as simple as that, it's always going to produce very trivial behavior. And I guess I was, I don't know, obstinate enough that I decided sometime in the beginning of the 80s that I would actually just do the experiment on a computer, because conveniently at that time I was involved with computers. I knew lots about how to do actual computer experiments and so on. I decided one day to actually just do the experiment and just see what happened with all those 256 different simplest cellular automaton rules. And the big surprise was they didn't all do trivial things. Some of them did. The most famous one probably is rule number 30. You can number these things in a simple way, where you just started off from one black cell, and it makes this really complicated kind of random-looking pattern. And that's sort of the. I view that as kind of the iconic version of what ended up sort of leading me to this new kind of science. It's sort of the example of how I think, for example, nature often makes complicated stuff, even though its rules are very simple. And kind of when I first saw the thing, I said, this can't possibly be right. There must be some way in which, by using some fancy mathematical technique or something, I can recognize that this picture that seems so complicated is actually has some sort of shadow of the fact that it came from a very simple rule. There must be some evidence of the simplicity of its underlying rule in the actual final picture that got made. So, you run the thing for 1 million steps, 1 billion steps, whatever, and you keep on asking, does it somehow resolve into something simple? Well, I did a bunch of those experiments, and I kept on realizing, no, it doesn't resolve into something simple. And that was a big affront to my intuition, because I kind of figured that, like when we do engineering, for example, if we want to make something that looks really complicated or that behaves in a very complicated way, we're used to having to do a lot of work. We're used to having to, do all kinds of software engineering or something to create this program that has very complicated behavior, these kinds of things. But this was a case where even though the rule was incredibly simple, the behavior that it produced was, for all I could tell, sort of as complicated as anything. And that was sort of the thing that launched me in the direction of building this new kind of science. I mean, in order to do the science, I ended up realizing at some point that I needed to build better tools to sort of do the exploration. I mean, it's kind of like in a distinguished earlier period of science, when people were first thinking about astronomy and so on. There was the kind of the big breakthrough that happened when Galileo was able to sort of make a better telescope and turn the thing at the moon and at Jupiter and so on and see what was going on out there. So similarly, for myself, I kind of figured I needed a better telescope, so to speak, to be able to look out into this computational universe, and that was one of the big reasons that I ended up building a Mathematica system, to sort of have the tool that would allow me to kind of go and explore the computational universe in an effective way.
So do you think it's safe to say that the better we understand the universe, the simpler its rules will be?
Well, so remember, there are two universes running around here. One is the computational universe of possible programs. It's a very abstract thing.
Right.
You know, we can invent any program on once. One can see what it does. Those are sort of the places in that computational universe are kind of the different possible programs.
Right.
That's sort of the first thing. The second thing is our physical universe. And the big question is, if we look, our physical universe probably behaves according to some definite rules. If it doesn't, well, then we'll never have a theory for it. But let's assume that it does. Then the question is, where are those rules in this computational universe of possible rules? Are they rules that are easy to find? Are they that are quite small and simple? Are they rules that are way out there, you know, the quintillionth possible rule in this computational universe of possible rules? And so that's a question, you know, it's a difficult question to know the answer to. Is our universe sort of the equivalent of a billion-line program, a 5-line program, a 200-line program? We don't know, and right now we don't really have a basis for figuring out the answer to that kind of question. I mean, the only thing we know, which is sort of a very basic fact about science and the universe and so on, is that there is order in the universe. It's not obvious there would be. I mean, there are maybe 10 to the 90th particles in our universe, and it could be that, you know, every one of them would have its own special rules and would just do its own thing. But one of the big things that we know, it's a point that's been made by, you know, theologians, scientists, whatever, for a few thousand years, is that there is order in the universe. The universe is not as complicated as it could possibly be. There are definite rules by which the universe operates. Now, the question is, it could still be the case that those rules, while they're definite, are really complicated. And, you know, if we look at the history of physics, one of the things that's a little bit disappointing is that it seems like every time we kind of investigate more in physics, we discover that things are more complicated than we thought before. It doesn't seem like we're kind of gradually going, as we look at smaller and smaller length scales or something like that, to a resolution where we'll discover that actually it's all really simple underneath there. I think that that's an illusion. I think that, in fact, it's very much like the intuition that one gets from things like this Rule 30 cellular automaton, that one is used to the idea that when things look complicated, they really are complicated underneath. But I think what one realizes from things like Rule 30 is that that doesn't have to be the case, that there can, in fact, be really simple underlying rules. So then the question is, for our universe, you know, I don't know whether the underlying rules are really, really simple or just kind of simple. And if they're really, really simple, then there's a good chance that if we just sort of test possible rules for the universe, then after we've tested a decent number of rules, we'll actually just come across the rules for our particular universe. And
is that the investigative process that you propose?
Well, so we don't know whether the rules for our universe are simple enough that that kind of exhaustive search can work. And we don't have any basis for guessing. However, it seems sort of embarrassing if the rules for our universe actually are simple enough that they could be found by that kind of search, and nobody looked.
Right.
Now, you know, as a practical matter, obviously, you know, I've been interested in doing this kind of search. So what actually happens? You know, that for a while I used to have a big computer in my basement that I used to tell people was searching for the universe, just because it's kind of a weird thing to do. But as a practical matter, what happens is you find a candidate universe. You set up a candidate universe. You set up some definite rules for how space and time might work and all this kind of thing. They're very abstract rules, because by the time you're dealing with sort of something that's that far below kind of things like space and time and so on, they don't seem very familiar at all. They're rules that involve networks and all kinds of things, can describe in great technical detail, but not the place. I think the main thing is that when you set up one of these sort of candidate rules, you say, well, okay, given that this was the rule for the universe, what would the universe be like? And the way you find that out is, well, you just run the universe. Starting from the very beginning, you let it run and see what it does. Now, many of these candidate universes are obviously hopeless. They, time stops after 3 clicks or something,
right.
or space is infinite dimensional or something like this. So they're obviously not our universe. There are other ones that are somehow, there are other ones that are sort of simple enough that you can use traditional mathematical methods to kind of be able to say everything about what happens in that universe. Again, obviously not our universe, because our universe isn't as simple as that. But what happens is, every so often you'll find a candidate universe, don't have to go very far, maybe 1,000 candidate universes. You'll start finding ones where the behavior is really pretty complicated. You run it for 1 billion steps. Maybe if you're lucky and you have a big enough computer, you can run it for 1 trillion steps. And still, it's blobbing around and doing all kinds of complicated things. And then the big question is, okay, so this thing that we just ran for the equivalent of some infinitesimal fraction of a second of sort of physical universe time, if we were to run it for 14 billion years, would it be just like our universe today?
Right.
Well, that's a hard question to answer, and it's not. There's sort of a theoretical problem that's all related to undecidability and Gödel's theorem and this phenomenon I call computational irreducibility that basically tells one that it's an irreducible amount of computational work to find out what this universe is going to do, and therefore to compare it with our physical universe. And that's something that we just have to be kind of lucky to be able to find things that allow us to sort of jump ahead in this sort of irreducible computational work to compare this kind of candidate universe with our actual universe.
So we can't just throw more hardware at the problem and say put in a string theory and run it to see if it's true.
Well, one's kind of working from two ends. One's working from, here's this candidate universe, let's run it, see what it does. On the other end, there's what do we know about our actual universe, and how far has particle physics or string theory or whatever got in abstracting from all the details of our actual universe to something which is sort of a simpler model that we can then go or a more well-defined model that we can then go and compare with what's happening in our candidate computational universe. But no, it's not essentially what we have to do is to sort of recapitulate the history of physics for our candidate universe. We have to go from this sort of phenomenon of what the universe does to sort of abstract what its natural laws are, and then compare those natural laws with the natural laws for the actual universe. So it's something where what's nice is that you start seeing some phenomena like various features of space and time and relativity and gravitation, maybe some quantum mechanics. You start seeing phenomena like that, and what's exciting, to me at least, is that you don't put any of this stuff in. You're starting off from these rules that are just incredibly simple rules about how little tiny networks get rewritten in a succession of steps and so on. And from those incredibly simple rules, there emerge these features that are some of the kinds of prides and joys of physics, like Einstein's special relativity or something like this. It's very non-trivial that one is able to effectively derive those observed features of physics from something as tiny as these kinds of computational models. And so, to me, that's a great encouragement that one's actually on the right track, that if one were to successfully go further, one would not just find these particular sort of fragments of physics, but one would actually find the whole thing. But the real question, I think, is our universe, in fact, sort of which serial number of possible universe is our actual universe?
Right.
It's something. It's a very Copernican kind of question, because we're kind of used to, in times past we used to have this very nice feeling of specialness, because it was like our life was special, our planet was at the center of the universe, all this kind of thing. Then we discovered, well, actually that wasn't really true. And instead, we got much more humble, and we said, well, we're just a typical, it's just a typical planet and a typical star and a typical galaxy, et cetera, in a random place in the universe. So now we can get to ask that question for the whole universe. Is our whole universe just a typical random possible universe, or is it somehow a special, low serial number, simple universe? We don't know the answer. And I think that the question is a little different for sort of the whole universe maybe than it is for sort of our place in the universe, just because well, sort of at a technical level, it's kind of that what, which integer is the most special integer. It's kind of a funny question because the integers go on forever, and it's not clear how you identify that, and so on. But actually, I have some guesses about. Usually, when there are questions like this about, it's sort of a funny science question. I mean, I think about history of science a whole bunch, and I say to myself, what's the analog of this question from history of science? And it'll be very exciting if we can say, well, this particular universe that we found in some sophisticated way turns out to be actually our universe, and this particular universe is serial number, 3214 or something,
or 42.
Right, or 40. Well, I know it's not. In the enumeration that I've looked at, I know it's not 42.
You've been through 42.
That's so sad to hear.
How many sets have you gone through? I mean, are you still going through sets? Are you still crunching these numbers in your basement?
Well, yes, not so much in the last year or two, because unfortunately or fortunately, the world of technology has gotten really exciting. And so I've been spending most of my available personal cycles on that rather than on universe hunting. But
it's kind of like SETI. It's kind of like a SETI process.
Could it be distributed?
Maybe. Yeah. Right. Well, I'll tell you what the problem is. So I thought that was going to be the direction it would go. I thought I'd be searching trillions of possible universes, and that it would all be very distributed, and I was thinking about, how to do it in as parallel a way as possible. Turned out I was wrong about the problem. It turns out that even you don't have to go very far in the space of possible candidate universes before you find ones where you have no idea whether they're our universe or not.
You don't have a test.
Well, the problem is that you start them running, and they do complicated things. Right. They're nice, rich, sophisticated universes. Maybe they have all kinds of things that are analogous to people doing radio shows in sometime in the future, but we don't know whether they're our particular universe or not. And that's the problem. Yes, we don't have a test for whether it's our particular universe. So it's not really a problem of let's distribute and let's be able to check trillions of universes. It's more we've got candidates, but we need to do the difficult science of seeing how they match up with our actual universe. And kind of I sort of know what to do, but it's funny because maybe it's it's just a technically complicated thing. It'll be a complicated sort of software engineering effort to sort of build all the essentially monitoring equipment for these universes to see what they're doing and to be able to figure out whether they correspond to our actual universe. So I'm looking forward to doing this. This is I've sort of tagged it as my next really big project to try and do these kinds of things.
Are others working on this, or is it a solo effort? Or?
Well, I mean, I have
I know you have a team, but
yeah, I have a team of people. But I mean, in terms of this direction and figuring out how physics might work, I don't think so. And it's kind of a shame. There's been physics as a field. I in my younger years, I was a card-carrying particle physicist who did all those fun kinds of things in the official physics way and so on.
When you were 14, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
Much younger.
Yes, right. Physics as a field has become quite mature. There are definite lines of development. People work on them. It's the idea that one sort of uses a completely different methodological stack is it's not really doesn't really seem like physics. Physics seems like the thing that has this particular methodological stack.
Right.
So what's ended up it's kind of this project in a sense has to be worked on by people who don't know physics. I mean, it's useful to know some physics for some pieces of it, but most of what you need to know is this sort of big stack of new kind of science type stuff and theoretical computer science and practical algorithm development and a little bit of dash of traditional physics here and there, but most of it is really not methodologically like traditional physics.
Does observational physics help in this? Do things like Large Hadron Collider or cosmic microwave background radiation observations, does that help in that narrowing, or is it all totally separate from that?
Well, here's the thing. If the rules for the universe are really simple, then sort of everything has to fit in that tiny that tiny set of rules, and the difference between one tiny set of rules and another tiny set of rules is going to be very big. So the difference between one set of rules and another set of rules might be space goes from being 3-dimensional to being 7.5-dimensional. And the question of whether the mass of the charm quark is exactly 1.5 GeV or 1.78 GeV or something is kind of not likely to be the point.
It's insufficient.
That is, as you turn the knob to go from one model to another, if the model is simple, that little turn of the knob is going to change a zillion things.
Right.
Now, it will be really neat if one can successfully find something where one says, this is physics, but by the way, it has this weird extra prediction that says that if you look at cosmology in this particular, if you look at some detail of the cosmic microwave background, if you look at, what happens at, 10 TeV in some particle collision, then guess what? It will do something totally bizarre that seems very different from what the traditional models of physics have said. And of course, if that happens, then from a sociological point of view, if people go out and do the experiment and do it correctly, and that's not a trivial issue, because often these experiments where people have a sort of strong emotional for or against kind of thing, it's very hard to get those experiments done correctly. But assuming it's done correctly and it turns out the model is right, then it's sociologically very significant because people say, wow, that was a surprise and it came out right. And so then everybody says, well, this model must be right. Then that's then sort of the case is closed, so to speak. But I'm afraid I'm not that hopeful that the features of our universe, that there will be features of our universe that are sort of surprising and within reach of kind of our current generation of kinds of observational techniques. I mean, I think it's sort of there's two sides to this. I mean, one is, will we be able to do the sort of computational work to validate whether our model universe is actually our universe, and then and can that be done in sort of the current epoch of computational development, and then can we do sort of observational things in the current epoch of observational development?
I'm looking at a 1987 article from Academic Computing talking about tablet computing. Is that the kind of thing that you're pretty excited about what's going on today? Is that when you say technology is exciting you today?
Yes, to some extent. I mean, I've got a little iPad 2 sitting on my desk here that I was just playing with, and it's kind of funny that
you predicted
that project. Yeah, right. It's interesting. I'm always more interested in the things I get wrong than the things I get right. I thought that we kind of sat down and this was a sort of a project that I did with some students at the university way back in '87, as you said, and it was kind of so what would the personal computer of the year 2000 be like? And I think what's disappointing is that so much of it was obvious.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, I'm reading, the insight is that with truly portable computational communication tools, we are not restricted to working in the office or at home. We can work anywhere. Tablet will provide access to anything we are used to having at the office, so there's no reason not to work somewhere else. Video conferencing will be vital if people are able to communicate effectively from afar. You predict pretty much everything.
Except Angry Birds.
Except Angry Birds.
That's right. I haven't looked at that article recently, but I'm sure there are, it was funny because that article was written at a time when I was working on a bunch of software development for Mathematica, and it specifically didn't mention much about software because that was kind of what I was doing, behind the scenes, so to speak. Right. So it particularly concentrated on hardware kinds of things.
You do say that the notion of programming will change substantially. Programs in low-level languages like C will start dying out like dinosaurs. I'm not sure that actually has happened. Filling their ecological niche will be scripts for high-level interpretive systems. That's true on the web for sure.
Yeah, right. It's right. It's still amazing that people write their apps in Objective-C, so to speak, right down at the level of sand, so to speak. I mean, one of the things that has happened recently that I've been kind of long waiting for is, I've been involved in developing programming languages for a long time, so I'm a big enthusiast of sort of what does it mean to make a programming language, and I'm sort of have spent, God knows how many zillions of thousands of hours, trying to make sure that the Mathematica programming language is nice and clean and develops well and so on. And that's sort of the, where kind of the concept of the programming language is, you think about all these pieces of computation that people might want to do, and you try and pick out what are the right primitives, what are the right kind of underlying words that people can use to kind of build up the programs they need to do in the most convenient possible way. I've spent lots of effort on sort of what's the cleanest way to do that. But one of the things that one thinks about is, okay, there's certain kinds of people where you can think about things in this nice, clean way and so on. There are other kinds of people who say, well, I just want to tell my computer what to do. I just want to say, in the language that I already know, my human natural language, I want to be able to just, talk to my computer and tell it what to do. Well, one of the things that I'd sort of long been interested in is, could one merge the notion of understanding natural language with the notion of this kind of precise language that one sets up for programming languages? And one of the things that happened last few months, actually, is sort of a development I find quite exciting with Mathematica and with Wolframalpha, where we're able to use kind of the linguistic prowess of Wolframalpha to let people type in kind of natural language English sort of specifications and have those automatically turned into precise Mathematica programs that can then be run or can be assembled from these small programs into bigger and bigger programs. So it's kind of, that's something I find kind of interesting. It's a case where we can, first of all, we can very much democratize this process of programming and go from something where, you kind of have to learn the special secret language of programming to be able to do it, to something where you can just use the language you learnt in your first few years, so to speak, natural language, to be able to kind of tell the computer what to do. I wasn't sure it was.
Of course, language. I've always thought language forms how you think about things is formed by your language, your choice of languages. And I've also always thought for a long time computer programming is really not about telling the computer what to do, but a syntax for describing ideas and algorithms.
Yes, I think that's an interesting point. And for example, the kind of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis about human languages, namely the structure of the language determines kind of how you think about things. Right. I think that is all the more true for computer languages. Right. And I certainly know, in Mathematica, where we have functional programming and pattern-based programming and symbolic programming and so on, the kinds of conceptualizations that people make of programs and of how they should implement algorithms and such like is very different from what they would think of when they were working in some low-level language. Right. But I think it's it is certainly the case that one of the things I've noticed for myself, I'm a obviously experienced Mathematica programmer by now. It's an interesting question. When I sort of think about how to write some algorithm or something, I'll often be able to start typing the Mathematica code before I could possibly verbalize what this algorithm is supposed to do.
Perfect.
You're fluent in Mathematica.
It's a perfect illustration. I do want to talk about Wolframalpha. Before we do, though, I just want to read the last sentence from this 1987 article on the future of the personal computer. The last sentence is, the sooner Apple gets to work on it, the better for everyone. 24 years later. They finally did it, Stephen.
yes, right. That was nice.
That was prescient. At least that was prescient.
Yeah, right. On this... Well, just to finish, because it was an interesing...
It's a great conversation. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Continue, please.
No. I mean, this point about using the computer language as a way to structure your own thinking. Right. And one thing that's sort of interesting in, for instance, in mathematics, people think about proof as something. I mean, proof is partly knowing it's true, but actually... proof in mathematics is a much less good test of whether you got the right answer than sort of writing a piece of software and doing software quality assurance on it. But the real role of proof is to kind of provide a framework for explaining to people how things work and thinking it through for yourself, sort of structuring your thinking. But what one realizes at some point is that computer languages are an even better way to kind of structure one's thinking about how something should be set up. And so long as one has a, quote, good computer language that doesn't require one to sort of waste lots of effort, it's kind of working through the kind of the weird features of the underlying computer hardware or something, then it's a really good thing. I mean, I think that's a general theme, and certainly in developing Mathematica, one of my big kind of objectives is, automate as much as possible. So kind of the idea is, this is a computer language. Let's let the computer do everything the computer can do. Let's leave for the human only those parts that really require sort of the strategic human decision. Let's make it so that basically you just have to say, well, I want to do this, and then the computer will, as much as possible, automate how it's actually going to get done. If there are 100 different algorithms that you could choose for, doing some particular graphics thing or some such other thing, the computer will automatically choose which of those algorithms to use. So you can just sort of delegate to the computer all of those sort of mechanical details.
Do you think there's a contradiction, though? That's why I bring this up, between getting better at understanding human language versus teaching a structured syntax designed for expressing and solving problems?
Well, I think that they are complementary. So
Okay.
what I found in using natural language programming with Mathematica is that there are certain kinds of things where it's what I'm doing is part of some very kind of systematic, structured area of sort of algorithmic space or something.
Mm-hmm.
And there's other times when it's kind of a weird special case. It's, find a complementary color or something. Okay, that's part of some systematic development about color triangles and things like that. But it's a lot easier for me to just say, complementary color to purple or something,
Right.
Than it is to figure out, okay, I have RGB color and I have to do this and I have to do that. Maybe not the best example, I'm not sure. But so what I found is that there are some things where it's sort of connected to this very structured. It's sort of a case where there's some kinds of operations where kind of all possible operations like that are worth considering doing. Where somebody's going to want to do, at some point, for some reason, sort of all possible operations that correspond to, let's say, different arrangements of the language primitives.
Right.
Then there are other places that are much sparser, where, for whatever reason, because of the way the world is set up, because of the way humans do things or something, there are just a few little scattered cases that are relevant, or that they're things that relate to kind of the world. So for example, in developing Wolframalpha, one of the things that was, in a sense, quite, scary to me was this. In doing Mathematica, we build everything up very systematically. There's a set of concepts, we build it up, it's all very, very structured and systematic. Then in Wolframalpha, we're trying to deal with sort of the whole messiness of the world.
Right.
In Mathematica, it's like, okay, what are the possible, ways that geometry can be set up for this type of system? What are the possible, even polyhedra or something?
Right.
What are the possible sort of arrangements of nested function calls, things like this? In Wolframalpha, it's, what are the cities that happen to exist in, Germany?
Right.
What are the administrative divisions of some country that draws its administrative divisions in a bizarre way? What happens when there's a country that has, more than one city it views as its capital city? There are all these weird sort of particular to the world special cases, or even doesn't have to be the human world. It could be, every substance has a melting point. So you think, until you think about helium, for example, which doesn't happen to, at normal pressure, doesn't happen to freeze even at absolute zero. So there are all these weird sort of special cases of the world as it actually is, and the question is, how do you deal with that? And can you deal with that in a sort of systematic computational way? And that's sort of a big part of the effort in Wolframalpha, is to think about how do you build frameworks that can let you deal with this kind of the way the world actually is. And one of the things that's nice, when we could imagine sort of making a completely systematic language, but it would be very inefficient, because the ways that we describe things, with all the special cases that we've sort of historically evolved in our natural language, are pretty good ways to describe the world as it happens to be, with all of its sparse, weird special cases and so on. So, that's a case where, again, natural language is the right medium, I think, for telling the computer what you want to do, rather than having to be very, very systematic about it, because what you're describing is ultimately not a systematic kind of thing.
Yeah, you don't know what you want to do. That's one of the wonderful things about Wolframalpha, is this serendipity of entering something like carbon, and the variety of information that you get some of this will be an answer to a specific question, but it's all serendipitous and fascinating.
I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking Wolframalpha is Google.
It's not a search engine.
They're different things. But from what you're describing about natural language processing, Wolframalpha sounds very similar to the problem that IBM was solving with Watson. What did you think of that, and how does that differ from what you're doing?
Well, so I mean, it was great because, among other things, it kind of showed people that sort of finding information isn't just about being a search engine. There's sort of more to answering questions than sort of being a search engine and getting a page of links. I think in a sense, Watson is a great evolutionary example of a pretty long development track in kind of information retrieval and text retrieval and so on. And it's actually the same, it has the same lineage as search engines, although they diverged at some point in the past. And kind of the concept is, you've got a certain corpus of text, and you break it up into little snippets, and then you're asked, given the question that's coming in, can you match that question that's coming in with something in the corpus of text that you've been given? And for example, I don't actually watch television very often, but I sort of made a ceremonial moment out of watching the Jeopardy thing and seeing what happened there. And one of the things I was really struck by was, if you looked at the kind of the candidate answers that Watson was producing.
Wasn't that fascinating? Yeah.
Yes, but what was to me, as kind of a nerd in this area, I noticed the miscapitalization of some of the words. And I noticed that occasionally there was one case where there was a word and there was a two after it. And what that shows one is those are text snippets.
Right.
The two was there because it was a dictionary definition, and the snippet included the two from the dictionary.
Interesting.
And the capitalization was the way it was because those are the ways that these words had happened to occur in particular sentences or whatever else.
Right.
So essentially what was going on there was a way of a good, the main technological sort of development, I think, was sort of the scoring mechanism for figuring out, okay, we've got this question, now what text snippets are kind of near that in our text corpus, what text snippets are kind of appropriately related to that question. Actually, it was sort of interesting. I did kind of a test of search engines. It was interesting, a practical test, because we work with a bunch of these guys, and it's interesting to see how their technology does. I did the test of, you just type in Jeopardy questions, and you look at the first search engine result page, and you say, is the answer to the Jeopardy question somewhere on that search engine result page? And the answer is about 70% of the time it is. Now, Watson was doing something more than that. It was not only giving me a whole page of output, it was saying this particular word or this particular phrase is the answer. It was sort of going the last step there. But it was sort of interesting to see that comparison. But so kind of the Watson and search engine idea is, you've got this big corpus of text, and it's written in human natural language. You somehow break it up into snippets, and then in the case of search engines, you do pure indexing. In the case of Watson, you do, you index it, and then you do all kinds of ranking to try and figure out which part of that text is the one that wants to be returned as the answer. So that's kind of that methodology. It's kind of a match up the input with the corpus that you've been given. What we're trying to do with Wolframalpha is something that is just much crazier, right? It's much more kind of radical, extreme kind of thing. So what we're doing is, you type a piece of input, we try and turn that piece of input into something that is a symbolic representation, that is a precise computable representation of that input. So we don't care what the actual textual representation of anything is ultimately. What we care about is what our precise internal computational representation is. And then in terms of the knowledge that's in the system, what we're doing is we're saying, we have this knowledge that's very, very structured. It has nothing to do with human natural language. It's kind of big arrays of numbers and algorithms and things like this. And we say, how do we take this thing that we understood that's kind of a precise computational representation of the question, and how do we compute the answer from that question? And that's that's sort of the idea. Now, it's not obvious you can do that at all. I mean, it's the fact that you can turn a lot of the world into computational stuff is not obvious. It certainly wasn't obvious to me. we've now gone through probably a few thousand different domains of sort of human endeavor and sort of facts about the world and so on, and made them computable in this kind of way. And it gets gradually easier in some sense after you've done 1,000 domains. The 1,001st domain is sort of easier, but the thing that's kind of shocking to me is always every new thing you do, there will be new little twists and curlicues that you haven't seen before. But the good news is that we have sort of a general enough computational framework that we're able to kind of handle all those different things. But so, in the case of Wolframalpha, what we're doing is, for a search engine or for Watson, it's basically limited in what it can tell you to things that exist somehow in the corpus of text that it's been given. And it's going to sort of regurgitate a piece of the actual natural language that was in that text. What we're doing is to say, given the knowledge that exists that we've put into computable form, can we compute an answer to the particular question you've asked? Now, maybe that answer has never been computed before. Maybe you're asking something about some, combination of chemicals or some, some particular, financial analysis question or some combination of cities that you want to know something about.
New York Yankees versus Boston Red Sox is a fun search.
Right. So we're still working on. We're about to have much more spectacular stuff in the sports area. That's been an area that we've been, for a variety of reasons, we've been kind of not jumping into with as much energy as other areas. But this year that area will become very wonderful.
It's hard to keep up to date, but I'm sure there's a lot of interest.
Right. But so I mean, the basic idea is, we're in a sense trying to create fresh, new
insights,
knowledge, rather than kind of rely on what people happen to have written down or thought about before.
It sounds to me like instead of interpreting a question for its meaning, if I have this right, you're sort of looking for what the representation of that question in the computational universe is, and then you're computing an answer. And so it doesn't matter what the meaning of the question is.
Well, in one sense it doesn't matter, in another sense it's all about what the meaning is. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, you say New York or something. We have to have a very definite computational entity that represents New York City. And if we don't, we'll never be able to figure out what's going on. We'll never be able to compute anything. If we have that definite entity, and we have a definite entity for, the planet Saturn or something, and then we ask about, viewing Saturn from New York City, then we can compute using celestial mechanics and so on. We can compute, where Saturn is, where the Earth is, where New York City is. We can work everything out about what, where you'll see Saturn in the night sky or whatever. But so at that level, we really have to know from it's sort of a very high bar. We don't just say, well, here's a bag of words. Let's just see whether these match up with something that we can see that's in this piece of text we have. Rather, we have to say, turn this piece of structured input, the piece of input that people have given, and people don't type flowing English into the Wolframalpha input box. They type some bizarre combination of fragments of English with some sort of soup of words. It's actually pretty interesting from if you're interested in sort of basic linguistics, there's sort of this whole idea that the way we express language is just sort of a surface structure of language that's a little different from the deep structure of how we think about the concepts that eventually get expressed in language. I have to say, I think that when we look at the input stream for Wolframalpha, the query stream, that what we're seeing is basically lots of deep structure of language kinds of things. We're seeing the way people choose to type things in and sort of quickly say in a few, however many hundreds of milliseconds it takes them to type something in, it's sort of straight from their brain in the most direct way, in the way that they're thinking about whatever concept it is, they're entering it, and that's what we get to see in our query stream.
I've always suspected that English teachers are trying to keep me from expressing deep structure.
Yeah, well, it's fun because in a sense we always we often refer to the kind of the niceties of English as fluff, right? We're interested in defluffing inputs that we're given, because when somebody says, what is the price of Microsoft stock today? what we eventually care about is Microsoft stock, price today. Now, it's not just that's in that particular case. Those words could appear probably in pretty much any order, but often there will be some grammatical structure that needs to be preserved. It's not just sort of the soup of words. But it's sort of interesting that when we express ourselves conversationally to other humans, there's a lot of kind of extra fluff that goes into what we say that I think has sort of a purpose of a certain degree of redundancy, which provides some robustness in our conversation that doesn't need to be there and doesn't end up being there in these kind of query streams and so on.
I remember looking at, and I'm looking at the site and I don't see it, but I'm sure it's here somewhere, at a fascinating discussion of how you parse what you get and break it down and what Wolframalpha does with it, and it's just fascinating. It's just and I'm sure that the process is constantly refined. We're running out of time. I don't want to take too much of your time, Stephen. I know you're very busy. People should absolutely look at Wolframalpha. There's Wolframalpha for the iPad, which I use, which I love. Of course, it's free to use on the web. And you're now doing, I think this is great, Wolframalpha course assistance in a number of different areas. And my son who's in Algebra 2, this is so cool. I'm so thrilled you're doing this. Mathematics is a little above his head, but there's a lot to be gained from your algebra app.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, it's kind of the plan is, Wolframalpha attempts to be kind of the broad, complete computational knowledge engine for everything in the world. What we realized is that in the modern times, modern kind of app times, it's often convenient for people to just have a particular app that is structured in a way that is specific to what they're doing. And we have a line of course apps that will be coming out with the kind of the tagline for the program is kind of an app for every course. And I think over the course of this year, we'll get a pretty long way towards achieving that. And then there's kind of a whole sequence of other kinds of apps, for example, aimed at different professions. So like we have a sysadmin app that will be coming out soon.
Can't wait.
It's fun, you say, I want a certain kind of level of RAID disk drive, and I want it to be, 10 terabytes, and, how many disks do I have to get, and so on, or it'll be all sorts of stuff. I was just looking at this and realizing that I thought I understood how IP addresses worked and how subnets worked and so on, and realized that actually it was more complicated than I thought. But with this app, I'd still be able to figure out what was going on.
That's so great. I love that. Yeah. I see you have algebra, calculus, and music theory now, chemistry, astronomy, physics, multivariable calculus, accounting, statistics, and more coming.
Yes, much more.
I can't wait to get a sysadmin app.
Yeah, the sysadmin one will be fun, and there's a couple of other professional ones that are coming in the next few weeks, I hope. One is a machinist's app for working out, you're trying to, I don't know much about this area, I have to say. You're trying to use some kind of milling machine, and you've got some kind of steel, and you push it at a certain rate and so on, and it can, because we know all the sort of physics of these things, and we know properties of all these materials, we can do a really nice job, I think, in figuring that stuff out. And then in a kind of a curious, just sort of a test case, we were sort of picking different professions we were going to try and make these apps for. We thought different kind of profession is where we have a lawyer's app coming out, which includes sort of the simplest level things like calendar computations and financial computations, but also lots of kind of computational things relevant to all sorts of good and bad things that happen in the world in kind of legal terms.
All right, like looking at precedents and things, or just general principles?
No, I mean things like if you're trying to figure out what was the weather like on such and such a day in such and such a place. What was if you're worrying about what was the typical earnings of a person in such and such a city in such and such a profession. These kinds of things.
Well, you could be cited in court cases soon.
Wolframalpha is such an amazing resource, and I think maybe a little challenging for people. They should go to wolframalpha.com and enter some examples. They have examples. Play with the examples to get some sense of what's possible, and then your mind will be blown. And it is such a great resource, and we're so grateful to you, Stephen, for creating it. We really appreciate it.
And thank you for the Easter eggs that are in there, like what is the meaning of life and is the cake a lie?
Yeah. Those Easter eggs, obviously there's a team of a few hundred people who work on this, and some people have become specialists in adding Easter eggs, and other people have become specialists in criticizing the Easter eggs.
I could see that.
What fun. Stephen, thank you so much for your time and for the contribution you've made to our lives. We appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Stephen Wolfram, Wolfram, Alpha.com. Thanks, Stephen.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Did you understand any of that?
I was hanging on by this.
Your mind feels like it's been refreshed in a spring shower of ideas.
Well, yeah, what it is, it's like, I see the outline of what he's talking about.
Fascinating.
And I want to drill down in and say, okay, well, when you're talking about that computational universe, it sounds to me like this. Am I getting it right?
Right.
Well,
that's why it's fun to get the chance to ask questions. You almost don't want to stop him because he's such fascinating things. If you go to his personal website, that's where there's a scrapbook of a lot of information. It ties well into Wolframalpha. That article, that prescient article from 1987 is there describing what a new computing device in 2000 would look like. They got it off by 11 years, but
in the grand scheme of the cosmos, that's pretty accurate.
They even say it's impossible to predict anything, and we're crazy to try, but here goes, and surprisingly right on. Thank you so much for joining us. We do Triangulation Wednesdays when we have a guest, and sometimes we don't, but most of the time we do. We're planning to have the fascinating Ray Kurzweil on. He's decided to defer it to next month because that's when his new book comes out. So we'll get him on next month, and lots of other good people coming.
Can't wait to talk to Kurzweil too.
Eileen's booking some great people for us. So tune in every Wednesday, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, live.twit.tv. And who knows, somebody great may be on, stimulating your mind.
You may find out that the meaning of life is not 42.
Shocking. And the cake isn't a lie.
It's not.
But for that information, go to wolframalpha.com. For Tom Merritt, I'm Leo Laporte. Thanks for joining us on Triangulation.